Here is everything you will need to have a full Sony camera setup for filming weddings in 2024. Camera bodies, lenses, memory cards, batteries, everything. All of the gear I talk about here will be linked in the description through my kit page. For the sake of transparency, I have not been paid in any way by any of these companies to talk about their gear. This video is actually not sponsored at all. Along with that, everything that I'm saying in this video, everything I'm recommending, it's all my own opinion. If you ask 10 different videographers what gear you should buy, you're probably gonna get 10 different answers. This is simply the equipment that I would buy if I was switching everything over to Sony. And to that effect, I have not personally used all of the gear I'm going to be recommending in this video. I do have experience shooting with Sony cameras, but all the gear I own is Canon. That being said, I have done extensive research into everything I'll be talking about. I really do think that this is the ideal Sony kit for wedding videographers. And again, it's what I would buy right now if I was going to switch over. Alright, let's get started with camera bodies. Now, regardless of which camera bodies you use, I would always suggest having at least 4 of them. One for you, one for your second shooter, and 2 stationary cameras for things like ceremony or toasts. That's how I'm going to be approaching this whole kit, so if you have a totally different way of shooting, adjust as needed. My must-have things in a wedding videography camera are no overheating risk, dual card slot recording for redundancy, and 4K 60 FPS. Which is why my go-to Sony camera is the FX3. It's a great camera and totally checks all of those boxes. Small and compact, but still super capable, great in low light and amazing autofocus. It's a very, very well put together camera. And with it being part of Sony's cinema line, it has a fan built in, so no need to worry about overheating. It's also got tally lights to confirm your recording, and as of the recording date of this video, Sony is promising a firmware update that will add shutter angle to the camera. This is the camera that I would get for both my A and B cameras. It is a bit spendy at $3,900, but I've seen it on sale pretty often, and with it being a few years old now, you can find a lot of used or refurbished options out there. I know a lot of people are going to say you should just get the A7S III instead because it's got the same sensor and it's cheaper, but personally, I would take the FX3 over the A7S III any day. Those cinema line features really make a big difference for me. For the C and D cameras, I would get the FX30 for $1,800. It's housed in the exact same body as the FX3, so all the buttons are in exactly the same place, all the menus will be the same, and any cages or accessories you have will work across all the cameras. You also have the same feature set across both bodies. To me, this is tremendously helpful as it means I don't have to remember how to use 2 completely different cameras on a busy and stressful wedding day. The main difference between the FX30 and the FX3 is the FX30 has a Super 35 cropped sensor, so you do unfortunately lose out on that full frame sensor. You're going to have a little bit worse low light performance and less shallow depth of field, but to me, those things don't matter as much because it's not the main camera body. This camera will really only be used for big moments like the ceremony or the toasts, times where you need to have more than 2 cameras. So in my opinion, those things really don't matter as much. What matters a lot more to me is having it meet those must-haves and being relatively cheap since this would be your 3rd and 4th camera body. I have heard some people recommend the ZV-E1 as a C camera because it has the same sensor as the FX3. My problem with that camera is that it doesn't meet my must-haves. It's only got 1 card slot, and because it's such a small camera, it does have an overheating issue. For shooting weddings, I would stay away from it. So for the camera bodies, I would recommend 2 FX3s and 2 FX30s, which will cost you $11,400 if you buy them all brand new. On to lenses. I'm actually going to separate this category into 2, one for zoom lenses and one for primes. Starting with the zooms kit, the first lens I'd get is the Sigma 24-70 Mark II for $1,200. It's dramatically cheaper than the Sony G Master version, and it's like 95% as good. I would stick this on my A camera and shoot the entire day like that. For my B camera, I would recommend the Samyang 35-150 for $1,400. This is a beast of a lens and crazy versatile, being able to go from 35 all the way to 150. And with that range, I really think that it makes the perfect B camera second shooter lens. Now there is actually a different version of this lens made by Tamron, who actually was the first one to make it, but the two perform almost identically, and because they're essentially the same lens, I'd just go with the Samyang as it's $500 cheaper. For the C and D cameras, I would get 2 of the same lens, the Tamron 70-180 G2 for $1,300. You could instead get the Sigma 70-200, but it's $200 more expensive and it's more than a pound heavier. Plus, the Tamron is actually 2 inches shorter, although it does extend when you zoom. With the FX30s being crop sensor cameras, this is going to turn into about a 105 to 270. So to me, I don't really care about missing out on the extra 20 millimeters on the long end. I'd rather save the weight and space and money. That's all I would buy though, just those 4 lenses. There's definitely a benefit to having other lenses as well, like a 16 to 35 type lens or a couple primes that can go down to f1.4, but I don't find them necessary to film a wedding. The total price for the 4 lenses here is $5,200. If you're more of a primes person though, here's what I would get. For my A camera, I'd go with the Sony 50mm f1.4 G Master for $1,300. And yes, I would get the f1.4 over the f1.2. It's smaller, way cheaper, and I guess I just don't care that much about the difference between 1.2 and 1.4 for wedding videography. You could instead go with the Sigma 50mm f1.4 and save yourself $450, but I think I would personally go with the Sony in this case. On my B camera, I'd use the Sigma 85 f1.4 for $1,200. This will give you a really nice A camera B camera combo with the 50 and the 85. I was going to put a 35mm f1.4 on this list as well for a wider angle, but from personal experience, 35 just isn't wide enough to capture a whole room when you're shooting wide establishing shots. So instead of putting a 35 and then also needing to add something like a 20mm onto this list, I'm gonna recommend picking up a Sigma 16 to 28mm zoom lens for $900. It's way cheaper than getting a 35 and a 20mm, and unless you really love shooting around that 35mm focal length, you probably won't use this lens very much anyway. I know for myself, if I'm shooting on primes, I'm definitely gravitating towards the 50 over the 35. But if shooting on 35 is your thing, Sony has a great one for $1,400, and I would get that one over Sigma's 35mm. For the C and D cameras, I would again recommend that you get the Tamron 70-180 G2 for $1,300. The total price for this kit of lenses is $6,000. To go with your lenses, I would definitely recommend getting some ND filters. This is by no means a necessity. There are plenty of videographers out there who shoot without them and still create beautiful work, but I definitely prefer to use them. You've kind of got 2 options here, the Polar Pro Chroma Helix filter for $300 or the Nisi True Color VND for $220. They are quite different, as the Polar Pro one is actually both a VND and a polarizer, but it's Polar Pro's most color accurate filter, and it's the same price as their normal VND with the Helix magnetic locking. And that Helix magnetic locking is kind of the whole reason I'm even including it here, because it connects with magnets. It's super fast to take on and off. The Nisi True Color filter does appear to be a little bit more color accurate, but to be honest, I'd rather have the speed of the magnetic connection instead of the perfect colors. The Polar Pro is a 2 to 5 stop ND, and the Nisi is a 1 to 5 stop. Both companies also offer an additional 6 to 9 stop filter, but I would personally just skip that extra filter and crank my shutter if I still need it darker after I hit 5 stops of ND. So I would get 2 Polar Pro filters for my A and B cameras, which comes out to $600. But the Nisi filter is a great option. I just prefer the magnetic locking of the Polar Pro. Choosing the right memory cards can be a little bit confusing with the Sony cameras, as both the FX3 and FX30 can take 2 different kinds of cards, SD cards or CF Express Type A cards. There's also some different requirements depending on the settings that you use to record. Here's what I would recommend doing though. I would get the ProGrade 256GB V60 SD cards, specifically the 2-pack, and I would buy 4 of these. That way you can dual record and have 512 gigs of storage on both your A and B cameras. I don't think you're going to be using more than 512 gigs on a single camera, so 2 sets per camera should be great. For the C and D cameras, I would get the same 2-pack of ProGrade V60 SD cards, but in the 128 gig version instead. And you should only need 2 sets rather than 4. Since these cameras will really only be recording at 24 FPS and used a lot less throughout the day, 128 gigs per camera is going to be great. Now for all of those recording requirements I mentioned earlier, V60 cards are going to work great all the way up to XAVC-S, 4K, 422, 10-bit, 120 frames per second. You will run into issues if you want to shoot XFAVC-SI though, or if you want to shoot at frame rates higher than 120. If either of those are the case, you're going to want to swap out the V60 cards for V90 cards for that particular camera. The total cost for all 6 sets of SD cards is $828. Battery life on these cameras is pretty decent, with it sitting around 2 hours per battery. However, a 10-hour wedding day with 4 cameras is still going to require a lot of batteries, which is why I'm going to recommend that you get 14 batteries. Yes, 14, although you'll only have to buy 10 of them because each camera should come with a battery. 4 batteries to share between the C and D cameras, and 10 batteries to share between the A and B cameras. Now, I'm sure that you could shoot a whole wedding day with fewer batteries, especially if you're only shooting for 6 hours or if you charge dead batteries throughout the day, but batteries are not something that you want to run out of partway through the day. So I would definitely recommend getting more than you'll think you'll need. Sadly, the Sony batteries aren't super cheap. It's gonna cost you $780 for the 10 you'll need to buy. The last thing in this video is camera support, the way that you carry your camera. This is highly subjective. Everyone likes to rig out their camera slightly differently, but hopefully this will give you a super solid starting point. If you're a gimbal shooter, I would recommend the DJI RS4, hands down. I think this is the best gimbal out right now, and with the Sony cameras being so lightweight, the standard RS4 will work great here. You don't even need to get the 4 Pro. Even with the Samyang 35-150, you still come in under the weight limit of the standard RS4. If you're a handheld shooter though, here's what I would get. The small rig cage for the FX3, along with their lightweight V-mount plate, the small rig light NATO top handle, and the small rig RE monitor mount. And for a monitor, I'd get the Portkeys LH5P Mark II. With this monitor in particular, you can actually control all of the main camera settings for the FX3 and even tap to focus right on the external monitor. As for V-mount batteries, I'd pick up the SmallRig VB99. 2 of those should get you all-day power to the camera and the monitor. Plus, if you go this route, you really only need like 2 camera batteries per camera instead of 5, so you can save a little money there. And then take everything I said and double it, so your A and B cameras are both kitted out. The price for the whole handheld setup is $1,140 per camera, or $2,280 for 2. In order to use your C and D cameras, you're going to need some tripods. I personally prefer the Peak Design style tripods, which is why I'm going to recommend the Ulanzi 0Y travel tripod. Although, if you have a little extra cash to spend, the Ulanzi Tree Root tripod would be a fantastic upgrade. It has been kind of hard to pick a tripod to recommend because there are so many different types and sizes of tripods, and everyone has their own preference. So this is one category that I would actually suggest you do a little bit more research on and figure out what type of tripod you prefer. And that is everything you need for a full Sony camera setup. It's a lot of gear, and it comes with a price tag to reflect that, just over $22,000 for the most expensive variation. But it's not really something most people are going to be buying all at once. Because of that, I do have an upgrade path you can follow. I would start with 2 FX30s. Now, I totally understand if you can only afford a single camera at this time, but I would push really hard to get 2 cameras as quickly as possible. Personally, I think it's really hard to make a good wedding film with a single camera, so I would do everything I could to get that second camera body. And the reason I would start with an FX30 instead of something really cheap like an older used A6600 is that I'm trying to lower, or ideally eliminate, buying placeholder gear. I don't want to buy gear that I know I'm just going to replace in a year or maybe 2. Instead, I would save up money for a longer period of time to be able to buy that better piece of gear right off the bat. Along with those first 2 cameras, you're going to need some lenses. So I would get the Sigma 24-70 Mark II and the Samyang 35-150. With the FX30's crop sensor, that 35-150 is going to be able to punch in nice and tight. If you can't afford both of those right away, try to get the 24-70 and something like Sony's 55-210, something as cheap as possible so you're not spending very much money, and then I would sell that lens as soon as you can afford the Samyang. In addition to the camera and lens, you'll also need some additional accessories. For memory cards, I'd get 2 sets of the ProGrade 256 gig cards and 1 set of the 128 gig cards. Pick up 3 extra batteries and just make sure you bring a charger with you to the wedding, and get 1 tripod. If the $300 price tag of the Ulanzi is too steep, you could pick up the newer LT32. It's usually on sale for around $180, and while it's not quite as nice as the Ulanzi, it's still quite good. And the rest, I would just leave alone. Don't worry about ND filters, don't worry about big handheld rigs, just shoot with the camera completely stripped down. You don't even need to worry about a gimbal right away. Once you're at that point where you have 2 solid cameras and 2 solid lenses, you can start saving. And from there, I would just start picking up additional pieces of gear off this list as you need them. Like I said though, avoid buying placeholder gear if you can, gear that just fills in the gap until you can get the thing that you actually want. Hold out and save up for the gear you actually want so you're not wasting your money. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, all the gear I talked about here will be linked in the description. Okay, bye.